May 12, 1945. The train, a long serpent of iron and steel, finally groaned to a halt, its wheels screaming a mournful protest against the rails. Inside, the women swayed, their faces gaunt, etched with the shadow of weeks, or was it months, of travel, hunger, and an omnipresent dread that clung to them like the grime on their tattered uniforms. They leaned forward, eyes wide with a shared, unspoken apprehension. They had been fed 1,000 narratives about what awaited them. Whispers in the frigid barracks of summary executions, the booming propaganda of officers desperate to shore up the morale of a dying Reich promising slave labor in forgotten mines, and the universal, chilling fear of violation and starvation that gnawed at their souls. Their uniforms, once symbols of duty, were now little more than threadbare rags, their boots cracked beyond repair, their hair tied back with whatever scraps of cloth they could find. They were no longer soldiers, not truly. They were remnants, auxiliaries stripped of purpose, women adrift in a world without a homeland. The heavy, metallic doors of the train hissed and groaned, slowly peeling open to reveal a sky unmarred by smoke and a breeze that carried no stench of steel or burning. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air was simply clean. One woman, her age perhaps 24, her cheekbones sharp and prominent like sculpted marble due to relentless hunger, was the first to descend the creaking steps. She pulled her worn coat tighter around her, a futile gesture, as if the thin fabric could ward off the invisible blows of impending humiliation. All around her stretched a landscape of unsettling quietude, flat, immense, and startlingly pristine. Wooden fences, meticulously constructed, dissolved into the hazy distance. Barbed wire, glinting with almost a surgical precision in the sunlight, formed geometric patterns that spoke of stark control. Yet there was no brutal shouting, no snarl of unseen dogs, no immediate threat. American guards stood waiting, their uniforms crisp, their posture a study in calm detachment. Their rifles were slung casually, almost respectfully, more like tools of their trade than instruments of immediate violence. The silence itself was unnerving, heavier than any cacophony of war. She braced herself, muscles tensed for the first brutal word, the first cruel shove. And then it came, not a sound, but a scent. It drifted on the gentle breeze, a phantom from a world long lost. Warm, rich, undeniably greasy. It was the unmistakable aroma of bacon, sizzling gently over an open flame. She froze, a statue carved from disbelief. And behind her the other women halted, a ripple of stunned silence passing through them. It was impossible, obscene even. Bacon was a word from memory, a cherished relic from mornings before rationing, from kitchens where fathers returned with their wages and children played beneath a sky undisturbed by sirens. To smell it here, at the threshold of captivity, felt like hearing joyous laughter in a graveyard, a profound violation of all they had known. Her stomach, a cavern of emptiness, twisted in violent rebellion. She vividly recalled her last meal in Germany, a thin, watery broth stretched with boiled turnips and stale bread that crumbled to dust in her hand. She had consumed it quickly, a desperate act, knowing her younger brother, if he still lived amidst the rubble of Leipzig, might not even have that meager sustenance. And here, the Americans, the enemy, were cooking pork for their prisoners. A dizzying cocktail of anger, profound shame, and a strange, reluctant yearning washed over her. The guards, with firm but not unkind gestures, directed them to form lines. Their voices, though speaking in a foreign tongue, lacked the harsh edge of their former captors. One even attempted a halting phrase in German, "Bitten schnell," he urged, a request rather than a command. The women obeyed,
each heavy step accompanied by the insistent, growing scent of breakfast. For some, it was an unbearable torment. One woman muttered curses under her breath, damning the Americans for mocking their suffering with such luxurious abundance. Another began to weep silently, her hands trembling uncontrollably against her skirt, the scent unlocking a flood of suppressed emotion. Yet for all their terror and despair, none could stem the involuntary intake of breath. The smell became a powerful magnet, drawing together fragmented memories and gnawing hunger into one bewildering, overwhelming sensation.
Inside the camp, the reality that unfolded was almost theatrically strange. The barracks were sturdy wooden structures, each housing neat rows of straw mattresses. Windows, surprisingly, allowed ample sunlight to flood the interiors. Buckets of fresh water stood ready for washing, a stark contrast to the scarcity they had known. It was no palace, certainly, but compared to the damp cellars and burned-out husks of buildings many had last called home, it possessed an almost deliberate order. A woman whispered that it reminded her of boarding school, and though her tone was thick with bitterness, the words carried a dangerous seed of comfort, a hint of something familiar in an alien world. The 24-year-old found herself drawn to the mess hall, where plumes of smoke rose from the chimneys. Through open doors, she caught glimpses of trays being set, not with the expected tin cups or slop buckets, but with actual plates. Her throat tightened, a sudden constriction of disbelief. She had steeled herself for brutality, for curses, for the complete stripping of her dignity. Instead, she found a quiet efficiency, a disciplined order that did not rely on cruelty. She did not trust it. None of them did. It had to be a trap, a meticulously staged performance, a softening of their resolve before the inevitable lash of punishment. When at last they were marched into the mess hall, the sound hit them first, the loud, joyful crackle and hiss of fat on iron pans, a symphony of sustenance. Soldiers in aprons, a surreal sight. Soldiers in aprons stood at long counters, expertly turning strips of bacon with metal tongs. The air shimmered with the heat, thick with the scent of salt and smoke, and something almost musical in its profound ordinariness. The women shuffled forward, their eyes darting, unable to reconcile their ingrained dread with the sheer absurdity of the scene before them. Plates were handed to them, heavy and real. On those plates lay generous portions of bread, steaming potatoes, and, to their utter astonishment, a strip or two of glistening bacon. The 24-year-old stared down at hers, her hand trembling uncontrollably. She thought of her mother, who had perished in an air raid 2 brutal winters ago, clutching a faded photograph of her father, who had never returned from the unforgiving Russian front. She thought of the skeletal children she had seen begging in the bombed-out streets of Dresden, their emaciated hands reaching desperately for scraps of coal. And now, here, in the hands of the enemy, she was offered bacon. Her chest ached with a profound, disorienting confusion. She yearned to refuse, to spit in defiance, to prove that she was not so easily broken, not so easily swayed. But her body, a testament to months of deprivation, betrayed her. She raised the strip to her lips and bit. The taste was an overwhelming explosion of sensation, salt, fat, warmth. It flooded her mouth with a torrent of memory and shame, but also a relief so fierce it felt like grief, a sudden, unexpected release. Tears, hot and unbidden, sprang to her eyes. She ate quickly, almost desperately, before reason or pride could reassert themselves. Around her, others mirrored her actions. Some women laughed through their tears, a sound brittle with hysteria. Some chewed slowly, reverently, savoring each morsel as if the food would vanish like a dream. Still others, their pride winning a temporary victory over their hunger, pushed the plate aside, unable to reconcile the luxury with their suffering. But the room, for a few suspended moments, was utterly quiet, save for the soft, rhythmic sound of chewing. An American guard leaned against the doorway, observing them. He was perhaps 30, his uniform impeccably pressed, his face impassive, betraying no emotion. But when one of the women looked up, their eyes met, and he offered the smallest, most subtle shrug, as if to convey, "It's just breakfast." That simple shrug was more dangerous, more potent than any weapon. It hinted at a world where enemies were not necessarily monsters, where captors could, astonishingly, offer kindness. It cracked something deep within the mythology, the carefully constructed narratives these women had been force-fed for years.
When the meal concluded, the women were led back to their quarters. The 24-year-old lay on her bunk, staring up at the rough wooden ceiling. The taste of bacon still lingered on her tongue, a ghost of flavor. She felt heavier and lighter at once, as though a great, invisible weight had been shifted, though not entirely removed. She did not know if she could trust these Americans, if this was genuine generosity or a calculated strategy. But one thing she knew with absolute certainty: her understanding of the enemy, of the world itself, had been irrevocably altered by a single meal. That night, as an unfamiliar silence settled over the camp, she listened to the faint, steady sound of guards patrolling outside. No shouts, no snarling dogs, only the measured rhythm of boots on soil. She closed her eyes, but sleep would not come easily. The bacon had filled her stomach, yes, but it had also profoundly unsettled her mind. If the enemy was capable of such order, such nourishment, even of something akin to mercy, then what other truths might she uncover in captivity? The question burned within her, hotter and more insistent than any hunger pangs. As dawn approached, the faint scent of bacon returned, carried through the camp on the morning wind. She breathed it in, a complex mix of longing and apprehension, knowing that the war she had now entered was no longer about armies or borders, but about the very foundations of her belief. She had been rigorously taught to expect only cruelty. Instead, she had been met with bacon. It was not forgiveness, not friendship, but it was something far more dangerous to her cherished certainties. It was undeniable proof of another, entirely unexpected reality. And the most unsettling truth of all was this: breakfast, she now realized with a profound chill, was only the beginning. The women quickly discovered that the most profound war within the confines of the camp was not waged with rifles or fists, but with insidious ideas that slowly, relentlessly gnawed at the edges of everything they had been meticulously taught. For years, they had lived beneath the relentless, pounding drumbeat of propaganda. Posters had screamed of American barbarity, of men portrayed as little more than ruthless mercenaries, driven solely by insatiable greed. The radio had painted vivid, terrifying pictures of savages in uniform, men who would burn, humiliate, and desecrate any German unlucky enough to fall into their clutches. Even the women who had toiled in offices or signal towers, far removed from the direct horrors of the front lines, had carried those terrifying images with them, like an inner armor against the truth. They had braced themselves for a brutality that, at the very least, would validate their deepest fears. But the initial weeks inside the camp caused those deeply ingrained images to falter, to crack. The Americans, though speaking little German, maintained a measured tone, their discipline unshaken, yet devoid of harshness. Orders were short, clipped, but delivered without the venomous undertone they had come to expect. Guards treated the women as a profound responsibility rather than as mere prey. Instead of the gnawing hunger that had become their constant companion, there were regular, wholesome meals. Instead of the expected filth and degradation, there was abundant soap and water, and a strict adherence to a calming routine. Each unexpected discovery unsettled them more deeply than any shouted insult or physical blow ever could have. The 24-year-old found herself relentlessly haunted by the stark contrast between expectation and reality. She remembered the impassioned lectures in the training halls where officers swore that capture by the Americans meant a fate worse than death itself. She recalled the whispered warnings from older women who claimed the Americans carried brutal knives for sport, that they laughed while casually slitting throats. Now, she walked past orderly kitchens where cooks, surprisingly donning aprons, stirred massive vats of potatoes, their faces conveying boredom rather than cruelty. She smelled coffee,
real coffee, not the bitter, burnt barley substitute she had endured for years, and heard the reassuring scrape of metal trays. She struggled to discern which was more difficult to bear, the lingering hunger in her belly or the ferocious war raging in her mind. Propaganda, for so long her unwavering compass, now spun wildly, its needle disoriented.
The others felt it too, this profound disjunction. At night, lying on their thin mattresses, they spoke in hushed, hesitant tones, weighing the fantastical rumors against the undeniable, palpable reality. One woman admitted, her voice barely a whisper, that she had expected rape the moment they stepped from the train, yet not a single guard had so much as touched her with malice. Another confessed she found herself unable to stop staring at the bread, white, soft, untainted by sawdust, a luxury they had been told was scarce everywhere, yet here it appeared fresh and plentiful in baskets, replenished without drama or fanfare. To admit relief, to even harbor such a feeling, felt dangerous, almost treasonous to their suffering families back home, struggling in the ruins. Still, the evidence mounted, undeniable and irrefutable. The camp's meticulous order was deliberate, almost theatrical in its unexpected normalcy. Roll call at dawn. Work assignments for some, light duties for others. Inspections, not with whips or fists, but with simple checklists and calm observations. The guards themselves seemed oddly young, barely older than the prisoners, their faces smooth, their boots gleaming with a polished shine. They stood with a quiet confidence that emanated not from shouting or intimidation, but from an inner certainty. For the German women, who had lived for years in a world defined by scarcity and constant gnawing fear, that certainty was as alien as it was infuriating. The 24-year-old began to notice smaller, subtler details that relentlessly gnawed at her carefully constructed worldview. She observed a guard casually sharing a cigarette with another, their laughter quiet and easy, as though the war were merely a distant nuisance rather than the shattering of nations. She heard music drifting faintly from a gramophone in the officers' quarters, jazzy, playful tunes, utterly indifferent to the concepts of defeat or victory. She watched as food waste was carried out from the kitchens, scraps of precious bacon fat casually tossed aside, and her chest tightened with a searing pain at the thought of children in Hamburg or Leipzig who would have brutally fought each other for those very scraps. The cruelty, she realized, was not in blows or hunger, but in the unbearable, undeniable proof that the enemy could afford such shocking abundance while her own people starved. There were moments of irony so sharp they felt like actual wounds. Once, as the women lined up for their midday meal, a guard attempted to pronounce a German phrase. He mangled it so thoroughly, so comically, that a burst of uncontrollable laughter erupted from several throats before shame swiftly sealed them again. The guard, far from being offended, only grinned, utterly unbothered, as if sharing in their mirth. To laugh at an American and not be punished, to survive such an act, that in itself felt like a profound fracture in the harsh, unforgiving world they had always known. Another time a woman dropped her tray, scattering its meager contents. A young American soldier immediately bent down to help her gather the mess. He did not sneer, did not scold, he simply shrugged, muttered something in his own incomprehensible language, and returned to his post. She stood frozen, as if she had glimpsed a fleeting ghost of a world where genuine kindness could somehow cross even barbed wire fences. Yet a deep-seated suspicion lingered, tenacious and unyielding. Surely, they told themselves, this benign treatment was temporary. Surely the true cruelty would come later, after their defenses had been lulled and softened. Some women staunchly refused to eat the bacon, tearing it into small pieces and leaving it untouched, as if to prove they would not be so easily deceived or corrupted. Others compulsively hoarded bread, slipping crusts into hidden pockets, a primal instinct in case the sudden, miraculous abundance vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The 24-year-old meticulously tried to balance her pride with the desperate instinct for survival, constantly reassuring herself that to accept food was not, by any stretch,
to accept defeat. Still, each bite tasted of a bitter betrayal, a betrayal both of the totalitarian regime that had so profoundly lied to her and the innocent civilians still starving across the scarred landscape of Germany.
At night, the camp's electric lights glowed steadily, a stark beacon against the oppressive darkness. Beyond the wire lay a vast continent in ruins, yet inside the fence there was an almost disconcerting order, a predictable routine, even a fragile sense of safety. It was a paradox they could not, dared not, fully untangle. Letters home, when finally permitted, were written with excruciating care, sparing all but to most anodyne details, consumed by the fear of disbelief. Who would possibly understand if they dared to write, "We are eating better here than you are outside"? It would sound like treason, or madness, or perhaps a potent, unbearable blend of both. Yet it was undeniably true. The Americans themselves seemed almost entirely oblivious to the profound, unsettling effect they were inadvertently creating. For them, perhaps, feeding prisoners well was simply a matter of established policy, a basic clause in the Geneva Convention, a mundane administrative task. But for the women, it was a profound, earth-shattering revelation that twisted the knife of doubt deeper into their souls. If their captors truly obeyed rules of fairness, if their captors genuinely offered food and shelter without explicit demands, then the carefully constructed image of America as a barbaric enemy utterly crumbled. And if that deeply ingrained image crumbled, what else, they began to wonder with growing terror, had been a monstrous lie? The 24-year-old found herself thinking of her brother again, with a fresh wave of aching tenderness. Had he died clinging fiercely to the belief that Americans were soulless monsters? Had he gone to his grave fighting phantom enemies while she now ate their food and slept under their watchful, seemingly benign guard? The thought hollowed her chest, leaving a cavernous ache. She could not admit it aloud, not even to the women sleeping beside her. But already the complex war raging within her own mind was far louder, far more devastating than the one she had so recently left behind. And so the days bled into weeks, each meal a stark, unsettling reminder that the old world, the world of absolute certainties, was irrevocably gone. The bacon, once merely food, became more. It was a potent weapon, a complex symbol, an insistent challenge. It forced them to question not only the identity of their enemy, but the very essence of themselves. Some women hardened further, retreating into an unyielding shell, swearing never to bend, refusing to offer even a flicker of a smile no matter how orderly or seemingly humane the camp became. Others, more cautiously, began to soften, hesitantly realizing that true survival demanded more than just defiance. It demanded a terrifying adaptability. The 24-year-old wavered precariously between these two extremes, relentlessly torn by the twin forces of hunger and pride, shame and an undeniable, overwhelming relief. One evening, as the sun bled a fiery red across the yard, painting the sky with streaks of crimson and orange, she lingered alone outside the classroom hut. In her hands, she clutched a notebook filled with her clumsy, nascent English sentences, her handwriting shaky but imbued with a stubborn determination. She looked up at the menacing barbed wire, its edges now glowing with an ethereal light in the dying sun. Beyond lay the ruins of a homeland she could barely imagine returning to. Inside lay profound lessons she could not yet admit she desperately wanted to learn. For the very first time, she wondered not what the Americans would do to her, but what they were already subtly, profoundly doing inside her. And when the insistent bell rang again, summoning them back to the hut for another lesson, she hesitated. Her feet felt heavy, caught between a fierce, instinctive defiance and an overwhelming, irresistible curiosity. But as she finally stepped forward,
She realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that the war had shifted once more. No longer a battle of guns, nor even a struggle of competing propaganda. It was now a battle for her very imagination, for her future. And the next thing the Americans planned to show them, she intuitively sensed, would cut deeper than any language or book ever could.
The heavy, metallic gates groaned open once more, the same sound that had, months or even years ago, swallowed them whole into captivity. Only now it released them, not into the past, but into a world they scarcely recognized. The women who stepped out were profoundly different from those who had first inhaled the bewildering scent of bacon with disbelief and suspicion. The 24-year-old adjusted the small, precious bundle she carried. A few meager clothes, a worn notebook filled with halting English phrases, a paperback book left behind by a surprisingly kind guard, and tried to brace herself. She had survived the structured confines of captivity, but survival outside the fence, in the chaotic unknown, felt far less certain, far more terrifying. The train that carried them back toward the fractured heart of Germany was crowded, rattling endlessly across landscapes scarred by an almost unnatural silence. Villages lay flattened, reduced to dust, their chimneys rising like broken skeletal teeth from the ash. Bridges hung twisted over lazy rivers, their steel skeletons catching the sun in grotesque reflections. The women pressed their weary faces to the grimy glass, searching desperately for any flicker of familiarity, finding only an endless panorama of wreckage. One whispered that the Americans had, in an unbelievable twist of fate, treated them better than their own bombed-out cities ever would. Another muttered, her voice raw with suppressed emotion, that perhaps their captivity had been a strange, agonizing mercy disguised. No one argued, for their thoughts were heavy with the stark, haunting images of meals eaten in relative order and cleanliness, while beyond the vast ocean their families had queued for endless hours for meager turnips and dry black bread. When the train finally ground to a halt, the 24-year-old disembarked into a swirling vortex of utter chaos. Crowds surged around her, faces gaunt and hollow, eyes vacant with a profound despair. Children, their cheeks sunken, their voices small and reedy with hunger, clung desperately to their mother's skirts. She stood motionless, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, overwhelmed by the cacophony of need, the sheer crushing weight of human suffering. For a fleeting, shameful moment, she longed for the regimented lines of the camp, the comforting certainty of regular meals, the predictable chime of bells marking the hours. Shame, sharp and biting, pierced her at the thought. Freedom, she had been told, was supposed to taste sweet. Instead, it tasted only of ash and an overwhelming, aching absence. Her hometown was a ghost, where once neat rows of apartments had stood, now only an endless expanse of rubble sprawled, bricks scattered like dismembered bones. She found the street where her family's home had been, only to discover it had been utterly flattened, erased from existence. A neighbor, limping and prematurely gray-haired, delivered the devastating news. Her brother had never returned from the war's maw. Her father had died in the brutal, frozen hell of Stalingrad. Her mother had been crushed beneath falling beams during a devastating air raid. The words landed without ceremony, yet they hollowed her chest as if she had been struck by a powerful artillery shell. She stood amidst the grotesque ruins, clutching her meager bundle, the ghost scent of sizzling bacon from memory rising cruelly in her nostrils. To have been fed so abundantly, so well, while her entire bloodline starved, was that truly survival or an unbearable, unforgivable betrayal? The days that followed were a strange, disorienting limbo. She found lodging with distant relatives who eyed her with a thinly veiled suspicion.
They had endured unimaginable hunger, biting cold, and the relentless terror of bombardment. She, however, had been a prisoner, yet she had eaten. Her cheeks carried a healthy color. Her frame was more solid, more robust than their emaciated forms. One relative, her voice sharp and accusatory, demanded, "What did you give the Americans in return for such treatment?" She could not answer. How could she possibly explain that survival had been offered to her in the form of quiet order, regular meals, even precious books, without the expected barter or humiliating debasement? Her eloquent silence only deepened their profound mistrust. On the streets, she heard the hushed mutterings about returnees. Some claimed the Americans had brainwashed them, indoctrinating them with insidious foreign ideas. Others sneered openly that they had grown fat and complacent in captivity. Children stared at her, their eyes resentful, their small bellies swollen with malnutrition, living testaments to the famine. She painstakingly avoided their gaze, for each glance carried the crushing weight of an unspoken accusation. At night, she lay wide awake, listening to her relatives shift restlessly in their beds, wondering if they truly resented her very presence, if they truly believed she carried a deep shame disguised as resilience. Yet, in the quiet solitude of her nights, the lessons she had learned, slowly, inexorably, returned to her. She remembered the chalkboard word, freedom, and the searing, unvarnished films that had utterly shattered her illusions. She remembered the dog-eared pages of Huckleberry Finn, the reckless, untamed joy of a boy on a raft, the sheer audacity of a story unbound by fear or convention. These vivid memories clashed violently with the devastation around her. The Germany she had returned to was not only physically destroyed, reduced to stone and ash, but profoundly broken in spirit. Neighbors muttered endlessly about blame, about revenge, about profound betrayal. The 24-year-old listened, her face impassive, but inside her, another voice, one she had first heard in the classroom hut, grew louder and more insistent. Still, guilt, a pervasive, suffocating blanket, shadowed her every step. Each time she smelled the meager food cooking, thin cabbage soup, bitter burnt barley coffee, her mind, traitorously, betrayed her with a vivid memory of bacon sizzling in an American pan. The contrast was unbearable, a constant torment. She desperately wanted to share her surreal experience, to tell someone, anyone, how it truly had been, but she knew, with a chilling certainty, how it would sound: boastful, ungrateful, utterly treasonous, and so she kept it locked deep inside her, the taste of bacon transforming into not just a memory, but a heavy secret, a burden too immense to ever confess aloud.
One afternoon, she passed a desperate crowd gathered around a military truck, where compassionate aid workers were distributing tins of food. Children scrambled frantically. Women stretched out thin, trembling arms. She stood at the edge, clutching her bundle, until a man in a familiar foreign uniform handed her a can. She stared at the label, American. The sight made her throat tighten, a sudden spasm of conflicting emotions. The war was officially over, yet here again the enemy was feeding her people. She wanted to scream, to hurl the can into the surrounding rubble, to reject this unsettling act of unsolicited kindness. But her hands, as if possessed, would not release it. She carried it home, where her relatives opened it greedily, scraping the precious contents into a pot, praising the Americans' unbelievable abundance. She said nothing, but inside her, something subtle yet profound shifted. The enemy had fed her once in captivity. Now they fed her people in ruin. The undeniable pattern could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. As weeks slowly gave way to months, she began to write again in her notebook.
Clumsy, halting English sentences filled the pages, interspersed with vivid scraps of memory, and profound, unanswerable questions that she could no longer silence. Sometimes she wrote about her lost brother, sometimes about her departed mother, but often she wrote about the camp, the unforgettable smell of bacon, the unnerving silence of the guards, the chalk dust on the sergeant's encouraging fingers. Her relatives caught her once, their faces creased with disapproving frowns at the sight of the foreign words. Why waste precious ink on their language, they demanded, their voices laced with suspicion. She lowered her eyes, offering no verbal reply, but in her heart she knew the answer, clear and undeniable, because it connected her, tenuously but powerfully, to a world that had not been utterly reduced to rubble, a world that held the promise of something beyond the ashes. Slowly, painfully, she realized that her captivity had not truly ended at the camp's gates. It lived on, deeply embedded within her, in the constant, agonizing conflict between memory and harsh reality, between the insidious poison of propaganda and the undeniable transformative power of her own direct experience. She was free in body, yes, but still profoundly bound in thought, relentlessly torn between a fierce, unwavering loyalty to the dead and the undeniable, unsettling truth of what she had personally witnessed. The bacon, the books, the films, they had not merely filled her empty stomach. They had fundamentally, irrevocably changed her very being. She could not, would not, return to the blissful ignorance she had once known, no matter how desperately she might sometimes wish to.
One evening she walked again to the desolate ruins of her street. The sun dipped low, bleeding a final, melancholic light across the broken bricks, casting long, skeletal shadows. She sat on a cold, rough stone, opened her worn notebook, and wrote a single, resonant sentence in English. "I am still alive." The words, though appearing fragile on the page, felt stronger, more resilient than any uniform she had ever worn, any ideology she had been forced to embrace. She closed the book, pressing it firmly against her chest, and let the profound silence settle around her, a heavy shroud. The taste of bacon lingered, a phantom on her tongue, no longer just food, but a potent symbol, both a gift and an unbearable curse. It had been the undeniable proof of a world existing beyond the menacing barbed wire, a world where enemies, against all indoctrination, astonishingly fed instead of starved, where carefully chosen words could replace the cruel sting of whips, where the boundless realm of books could replace the crushing weight of unquestioning commands. It was not simple mercy, not true forgiveness, but something far more dangerous, far more potent, possibility. And as she stared out at the heart-wrenching ruins of her once vibrant city, she realized, with a sudden profound clarity, that her survival was not the end of her personal war. It was, in truth, the bewildering, terrifying beginning of another. One fought not with conventional weapons, but with the complex, interwoven threads of memory, profound guilt, and the fragile, flickering hope that perhaps, just perhaps, humanity itself could still be meticulously rebuilt from the ashes, brick by painstaking brick. She rose, tucking the precious notebook securely under her arm, her steps slow but imbued with a new, quiet deliberation. The ravaged streets around her echoed with the hollow sounds of pervasive hunger and festering bitterness. Yet deep inside her, the sizzling echo of bacon, that profound, unsettling taste, stubbornly refused to die. It whispered of inherent contradictions, of profound truths that relentlessly unsettle,
of unpredictable futures that might yet be written by her own hand, guided by a new understanding. And as night finally fell, enveloping the devastated city in its dark embrace, she understood with a clarity both terrifying and liberating. The war, in its conventional sense, had indeed ended, but the real, far more profound battle, the one for meaning, for identity, for the very soul of humanity, was, astonishingly, only just beginning.